Hello and welcome to another episode of the Clark-Smith podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Lifshits, co-founder at Dwelly. Dan, we've known each other for some time since your Gett days, so I'm delighted to see you on this journey, this founding journey as well, having built and scaled systems and businesses before. So Dwelly's quite a unique business. I think it's more of this AI roll-up type of strategy that we're starting to see more and more. But before we get into Dwelly and I suppose how that building's going, the challenges that you're facing, give me a little bit about your background. What's shaped you in terms of that context to, I suppose, lead you on this entrepreneurial journey?
Sure. First off, thank you very much for inviting, and I'm happy that this relationship keeps growing and growing kind of over time. So thanks for having me. Um, I think that it's not a simple answer with regards to kind of what is shaping kind of yourself as entrepreneur and kind of what you want to be kind of doing in life, et cetera, et cetera. One of the key things I think that a lot of entrepreneurs are driven by that I find quite common is I think being uncomfortable or being kind of unhappy with how things are run today. And just like, I think that you need to be in the state of mind where you just cannot see things continue evolving and working the same way, but you understand that you have to try to change something to make it like a better thing. And I think that this is what kind of drives all of us, to be honest, that somewhere we're uncomfortable with how things are being done and we're faced with them ourselves and we're saying, guys, enough, I cannot tolerate it anymore. I need to roll up the sleeves and go kind of change it myself. So I think sometimes comes from the personal pain. I think sometimes it comes from the desire to kind of, in a way, to prove yourself in the eyes of someone else and kind of as if earn someone's kind of love or attention or whatever that was. I think primarily coming from some of the childhood traumas. But I think it's like a mixed bag, and I think in each one of us, it's also a combination of things. You entrepreneur yourself, so you know kind of the drill and the story yourself as well. It's I think a mix of things. But yeah, above mentioned mix.
Yeah. So was it that itch that you felt that you had to scratch off after Gets?
I think that it was long before that.
Okay.
There were kind of some projects that I was doing kind of before that. I think Gett was quite kind of fundamental in getting a little bit more of a structured experience how to be doing things, and then seeing through much bigger stories evolve and like learning from that and understanding which things do work, which things do not work that well, to just take on these learnings into some of the kind of next journeys. But I think that always seemed myself, and at least there was a desire kind of definitely to kind of try to shape some things and then wherever it would take.
So it sounds like you're saying, McKinsey, Get was still some of that learning experience. You're still figuring stuff out before you felt ready to go and do it. Is that right?
For sure, and I think that kind of iterating and learning while there, because it might be perceived that you're part of something kind of much bigger and something corporate, et cetera, et cetera. Reality is, I think, quite often you're leading completely entrepreneurial streams within kind of even the bigger businesses that you join. And I think I was always looking for this sort of things. For example, kind of some of the transformations that we were driving in Gett from almost like in a way shifting or pivoting even to some extent from kind of being kind of a B2C ride-hailing kind of provider to becoming more of a B2B platform for the one-stop shop travel. And I think that we've been establishing some of this first kind of baby steps on this vision and partnering up with global ride-hailing companies kind of in the world, such as like Lyft, such as Ola, such as like many, many more in the UK included as well. I think it was like almost 0 to 1 type stage. So kind of
Mm,
even though it's in a much more kind of bigger setting, but I think quite often you're working on highly entrepreneurial stuff, and it's not like just continuing and perfecting the things that already exist, but building things from scratch. So I think I always was like attracted to this sort of like establishing new type things or picking up stuff where like almost doesn't exist and works very bad in a very kind of high degree of structured context
yeah,
and setting.
yeah,
McKinsey obviously was about something slightly different. So I think
yeah.
it already started evolving more throughout the Get story than McKinsey.
And what surprised you most going from that, okay, you say 0 to 1, but you're in that corporate structure, so there's a bit more technology resource around you. What have you found the most surprising thing going into that sort of complete startup world?
That's a good question. I think that one of the most, I cannot say kind of, you get to sense and to feel them. I cannot say that they're kind of completely surprising to some extent, but I would say that the degree, I think, of it all depends. I think a lot of entrepreneurs have, maybe I'm a bit generalizing and maybe I'm talking about myself, but I think a lot of entrepreneurs sometimes having a bit of a hard time on decoupling themselves from kind of their professional kind of journey and who they are, et cetera, just simply because the professional journey means so much to them. And I think that if there is high degree of association of who you are and how, in a way, successful you are as a human being, that is like
Mm.
highly attached to kind of how successful you are in your professional journey because it means so much to you, then I think that you start taking some of the ups and downs of the professional journey obviously much closer to your heart, simply because like that implies that impacts like, are you successful as a person to start with? And I think that whenever in any journey, it's
Mm.
so any journey would have, I think, quite crazy kind of emotional ups and downs. So meaning that I think that you just need to be ready for that. I think it's not something kind of in a way new or something that you never heard of, or obviously all of us have a lot of friends that are entrepreneurs and that are on this journey. But I think that it's a very personal story, I think, into how everyone takes these ups and downs and how they reflect through that and what kind of inspires them to continue going. I think that's one of the key things. And the downs, I think, quite often would be quite deep and they would be sometimes quite long and it would be quite hard. I think that's exactly the reason why there needs to be a somewhat kind of much bigger kind of why type answer or like a mission type answer that would like incentivize to continue going, because I think that's one of the only things that every single story will have hard times. It's like taken for granted. I think the question is just how hard would be these hard times. And I think the question is only kind of how kind of you will be able to reinvent yourself, just to wake up the next morning, say kind of turn the page, forget about what happened, kind of let's continue moving on. And like what is this driving factor into kind of what is the bigger vision that you're going after that doesn't kind of let you sleep at nights and pushes you forward.
Have you ever had a moment where you wondered, am I built for this entrepreneurial journey?
Not yet, I think, not at the moment, and I'm not sure it would happen because I think that there are a lot of like benefits that come along to that, such as, for example, that you are fully in control of your life, meaning
Mm.
that there's no more such thing as like effectively work-life balance because like your work is your life is your work. I mean, it's highly interlinked, and you don't need to kind of select between things effectively. I think that it's the kind of some extent of gratitude, and then maybe the feeling of when you're seeing the results and kind of some of the reinforcing loop of, in a way, yeah, some of the kind of successes that kind of inspires you to kind of to keep going. So I'm not saying that there are kind of only negatives, right? I'm saying that it's, I think, more balanced picture and you're
Yeah.
having both sides. The question is like, is one outweighing the other?
Yeah. You said once to me that this will either be a $5 billion company or you'll get divorced. How do you reconcile that on a daily basis to keep going, keep driving forward when I suppose there's always the thought of an exit route.
I mean, obviously, it's rather kind of a jokey punchline. Obviously, kind of packing all the things and moving kind of up north to Hull, kind of 4 hours door to door away from London, and spending a lot of time kind of without your family and without your kind of newly born 1 year old son. Obviously, kind of sometimes it comes exactly at this like compromises and like
Mm.
choosing or something in the middle. So I think like this jokey punchline that like either it needs to be something big or we're getting divorced, I think is rather, it's obviously not what kind of not the only thing that like it's, and obviously I haven't been put at this crossroads that either this happens or that happens. It's rather kind of my internal joke to convince myself. But this is kind of not the key factor, kind of to try to make sure this being kind of a big story or something. I think that like what drives first and foremost is that kind of, for example, if we talk about Dwelly specifically, that it's about kind of to a significant extent reshaping and reinventing the way that the rental experience works for kind of all of the parties of the market, being the kind of landlords and the tenants and maintenance contractors and the kind of agents themselves that work in the estate agencies. And I think that coming through this experience kind of multiple times myself, seeing kind of lots of other friends and kind of colleagues and everyone around, both as a landlords, as a tenants, again, as a contractors, I think that there is some sort of an agreement in this ecosystem that there is definitely a better way how to be doing things, more technologically, more streamlined, kind of just with a better eventual user experience, again, for all the parties of the ecosystem. And I think that just after kind of going through this sometimes painful kind of process kind of ourselves, I think that this is exactly kind of coming back to the beginning of the conversation. You're seeing sometimes that you kind of cannot tolerate things to continue working such a way because you definitely know that there is a better way in the world how things potentially can be run, especially with the kind of modern progress in technologies and kind of modern ways of how you can manage some things. And I think it's more about that kind of you see the picture of the world where you clearly see this working differently compared to kind of how it works in status quo. All the other kind of personal factors and other things, I would say rather in addition, but I cannot say that they are the driving force.
Yeah. So how did that mission evolve? Because obviously you've got a couple of co-founders that you're working with. But how did the mission for Dwelly come about?
Yeah, kind of effectively, I think that obviously kind of well coming from the backgrounds of the highly operational tech-enabled marketplaces, would it be Gett, would it be Uber? And then I think that we were all kind of on the outlook of what are the other markets that are kind of huge in its size, number one, and at the same time kind of remain being highly operational businesses. What are the other markets that also kind of preserve a typical kind of marketplace model and the highly fragmented kind of model on both the kind of demand side and the supply side of the marketplace. And obviously the kind of rental marketplace or kind of in general, the letting agencies or estate agencies do tick the boxes, kind of all of them kind of big time, because effectively it's like yet another highly kind of transactional operational marketplace. Maybe with the only difference to some of the kind of food delivery companies or ride hailing or some others is that the frequency of the transaction happens a little bit kind of not as frequent in kind of letting space as it is in ride hailing, for example, where kind of in lettings usually people rent the property once in kind of a couple of years, or kind of in ride hailing you usually kind of take a taxi a few times a month. So kind of obviously the key difference is frequency, but otherwise kind of lots of things do resemble very, very similar patterns. And that was partly kind of exactly the life journey, and I think the thinking journey that took kind of my co-founders, Dmitry and Ilya, in their kind of previous business on the same kind of trajectory to build what eventually kind of in less than 3 years became the largest tech-enabled letting agency focused on long-term residential rentals in Eastern Europe. That the guys kind of successfully sold to one of the largest, probably kind of the largest real estate developer in that kind of part of the world at some point of time. And I think that was like foundationally the inspiration for effectively kind of what we're building now, because I think that that inspired on the journey that clearly there is kind of another way how you potentially can be running kind of a letting agency, being kind of to some extent much more tech-enabled, being kind of with more technological kind of user experience to the kind of landlords and to the tenants and to all the parties of the marketplace. So I think that that served like as a foundational inspiration for kind of Dwelly effectively, with then already kind of some adjustments with regards to the details of the kind of specific market intricacies, nuances, and kind of go-to-market and what specific needs should we address with kind of more focus kind of specifically here in the UK and in Europe. But in general, that was the inspiration for sure.
No. And obviously, you've been listed in Sifted for sort of top 10 AI companies to watch in Europe. It's a roll-up strategy, so there's M&A as well as operational efficiency AI in the business. What's been the response when you've looked at acquiring, existing agencies? I think it's sort of baby boomers that are look close to retirement that you're more specifically targeting. Um, but what about the teams? Because obviously they've worked in that legacy way for a long time. There could be often resistance to that change.
hmm Yeah, I think that there is like a couple of points that you're raising and all are very good. I would like separate them probably kind of into two things. I think that number one, kind of with regards to our kind of go-to-market and what are we actually doing and how it coincides with all the current kind of trend of the agentic AI application layer and how it coincides with the trends of kind of baby boomers, unfortunately, kind of not getting younger and like a lot of them retiring and they have no one to kind of leave the business over to them. I think that this actually is not kind of completely not exactly kind of how we arrived to kind of what we're building, because I think that it was rather a coincidence that then the world and kind of all the investors' perspective caught up with that trajectory exactly at the same time as we started building Dwelly. Because I think that our initial thinking was that kind of how can we build a better version of the kind of letting agency, a tech-enabled letting agency effectively. And then when looking into kind of what is the best way of the go-to-market to achieve that, then it became quite evident very early on when we were doing the kind of market research, again, here in the UK and in the US and in Europe, that acquiring of existing kind of letting agents and estate agents is the kind of effectively fastest, but eventually it's the only way how to kind of grow quick enough to achieve meaningful scale. Because like effectively this is the problem. That's what we kind of learned the hard way in the previous business, that organic acquisition of the kind of landlords and the tenants one by one is quite a tricky and not really kind of scalable operational machine effectively for structural reasons of the kind of average tenancy term and of the frequency of transaction effectively. And that's exactly kind of what inspired us to the idea that eventually there is an opportunity to somewhat kind of merge the best of the two worlds, where on one end it would be kind of the go-to-market would be about kind of acquiring existing businesses, because that's effectively kind of the only way how to kind of gain scale fast enough. But then effectively our second kind of leg of the business is the technological leg, where effectively kind of after acquiring the business, we're kind of putting that landlord portfolios and the kind of tenancies and operations on our technological kind of platform to try to kind of improve the effectively enable the kind of current agents with better workflows and how they can kind of run the business in a more kind of enjoyable and to some extent kind of more efficient way. So I think that like the fact of all this like investors trend of the so-called kind of AI enables roll up, I think that kind of was picking up exactly at the same time as what we're kind of starting to kind of to build. And I think it like in a way coincided into something kind of much more magical that obviously kind of happens with Dwelly today, thanks to kind of as the output of that being listed in some of the kind of sifted effectively newsletters and some other things. So I think it was rather a coincidence. Talking about your kind of second point about the reaction of the current agents to kind of change of the workflows, I think that very, very few people can say kind of proudly that they do enjoy doing repetitive, mundane admin operation work. I think that very, very few people get excited by that. And a lot of the industries that we're talking about that potentially can be kind of streamlined to some extent with better technologies, would it be accounting firms, or would it be tax advisory firms, or would it be lawyers, or would it be insurance mortgage brokers or wealth management? I think that this is the examples of the industries and the professions where the kind of trained, skilled, effectively kind of professionals do spend quite a lot of time on quite repetitive, to some extent, kind of admin kind of workflows that do not require kind of all their kind of skill set and learning that they received in their life to be doing that. But if eventually kind of because they are also the ones that are interfacing the customers and that are kind of providing the service, then it's like something that is in the current traditional way of how the kind of CRMs or technology products are being built. It's a little bit harder to kind of decouple the customer facing part of their role and some of the kind of a bit more back office admin part of their role. And that's why you eventually kind of ending up having kind of a really skilled professionals that spend quite percent of their time on something that kind of can be done by someone else, or that can kind of does not require maybe that much of a conscious human judgment effectively.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly exactly kind of what we are trying to kind of solve and what we're here after, because I think it's not about of kind of let's come in and change kind of the way that the agents working kind of completely, but I think it's rather kind of there is in every role there is like two aspects of the role. I think that there is the part of the role that is about serving the customer and about kind of difficult sometimes conversations with either kind of the landlords or the tenants, or solving some of the more kind of detailed situations that do require kind of personal human judgment or some conflicts in the tenancies between the tenants and the landlords. And this is the part where the kind of human perception and judgment is required and would never go away. And that's exactly kind of where I think that all of the parties of this ecosystem get to evaluate how good you are as the business, like how kind of good you are to respond to some of the critical situations, how kind of quick you are to follow up on some of the fires or firefighting with some things. So kind of this it always would be there and would never disappear. I think that the second part that potentially can be decoupled, and that's exactly what can be solved, is exactly this like more kind of back office admin part of the work that, again, as we started, I think no one really enjoys doing, and that is like quite repetitive. And sometimes is exactly the part that can be kind of enable the people to be done to some extent with the technology and in a way kind of more automated way. And that's exactly what allow kind of the people then to start spending less time on some of the work that they are less excited about, but rather focus on their time on something much more customer facing to allow provide a better service to their existing customers, to allow growing the customer base faster for the reason of like they just have more spare time to do that, and so they can kind of focus on that. So I think it's about this redistribution of their time rather than kind of changing their roles and responsibilities completely.
Yeah. Obviously, AI is advancing at ridiculous pace in the modern world, and things are changing almost on a daily basis. What's been working and what hasn't worked? What have you thought you could automate or use technology to provide, but actually it's not quite there yet?
I think that different kind of AI models are great in different things. Like if you talk, for example, about Mistral, then I think it's very known to be the greatest in OCR and documents recognition and about kind of different patterns. I think that if you talk about kind of ChatGPT, it's great about contextual logic and it's great about kind of challenging something. So I think that all models obviously are catching up, and I think especially as it has to do with some of the kind of being sometimes kind of more empathetic to some of the personal situations that sometimes kind of has to do with resolving some of the kind of direct customer conflict, let's say, because we're a service provider, but effectively on the marketplace between two parties. So like sometimes we need to act as a kind of intermediary between the things. This is exactly sometimes where kind of the personal judgment for now kind of still does a better job, at least in our experience. But I think that it's also kind of partly about which model to apply for which kind of use cases, because you can use ChatGPT and Whisper, for example, for some of the kind of phone conversations. You can be using Grok for kind of some other search models. So I think it's also kind of the question of how you kind of use a mix of different models to serve for different goals. Yeah, but I think especially kind of when it has to do with some of the kind of contextual real-time conversations, this is definitely where I think the kind of technologies are still catching up.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, people see you buying the business, people in the business, I'll say, and naturally they'll know that you're there for efficiency and productivity and so on. Do they see you as a savior or as an executioner when you walk in the doors?
I think that kind of I would probably slightly disagree with you, kind of what we're here for. I think that we're here first and foremost for providing the kind of outstanding customer service to our end customers, to the landlords, to the tenants, to contractors, to kind of all the parties of the marketplace. And then I think that it's about kind of how we can be providing the service in the best way possible. For example, if it's just about, for example, some streamlined automatic type correspondence where after we have received the tenancy payments and after we reconcile these payments, we need to be providing an automated landlord statement to the landlords on the first day of every month. Then, for example, this is an example of the activity that does not require kind of a human intervention kind of to be done, because like the system can do significant part of that after we've just received the payment and reconciled it, right? Where today in the status quo, that for example would be done to quite significant extent manually by kind of agents or by the finance administrators of the estate agents or someone else. So I think that kind of this is about eventually understanding what are the key needs of the customers, of the landlords, of the tenants, and then how can we best address these needs in the mix of kind of human way and kind of technological way to serve for the better good. And then I think talking about those activities that actually do not require kind of a personal participation kind of being there, but rather is just about kind of should be working as a Swiss clock and like at a specific time, specific communications needs to come out. Then, for example, about kind of automating the things that otherwise kind of would either not be done at all or would be done kind of in a manual way. Like, for example, quite a lot of landlords do love the systematic updates about how their tenancy is ongoing, especially, for example, when they are kind of on the process of kind of letting the property out. So meaning from the stage when kind of some of our property specialists have gone to the property, have created the content of the property, then we put the properties on the kind of property portals, for example, in the UK, such as Rightmove, Zoopla on the market. And then, for example, streamlining then all of the flow of the rentals, such as, for example, receiving the offers from the prospective tenants. We then kind of select the best tenant according to the criteria. So we allow the tenant to pass all the kind of background checks, such as ID verification, such as right to rents, references, etc., etc. And a lot of landlords do love to be posted and kept in the loop about kind of what's happening across the kind of stages of the process and where they are on the current process. So, for example, kind of this is a prime example of where kind of technology, just simple automation and like sending just the reminders or pings to the kind of landlords about kind of on which stage of the process is the current tenancy is happening, where, for example, the status quo implies that either it wouldn't be done at all, and then kind of the landlord would be just a little bit lacking visibility with regards to kind of where their property is. Or if it would be done, then it would be done as a manual kind of communication being put in the sort of email or kind of WhatsApp message or something manually by an agent to the landlord. So this is, for example, the prime example of where kind of some automation can help, but it's not about the kind of automating some of the activity that, for example, kind of already is out there and is done just manually, but now is done by technology, but rather kind of is something kind of potentially new that we're introducing, but that is obviously needed to provide a better service to the kind of partners of the kind of ecosystem. So I think it's like, this is what we're solving for the first and foremost. It's about kind of improving level of service to the end customers.
Absolutely. And looking forwards, obviously it's a roll-up strategy, so there's M&A. I mean, how do you think about capital efficiency, sort of return on investment, timeline for a newly acquired agency to become cash generative?
Yeah, I think that kind of not me to kind of I think share the things. I think that there is a lot of like private equity kind of playbooks being written on kind of how to execute the rollout. I think that the kind of beauty of some of these businesses and the kind of business model in general is that effectively kind of we are already almost always kind of taking a cash accretive profitable business, and then kind of sometimes with allowing kind of some of the efficiencies and allowing then the business to grow faster through the kind of better level of service or through, for example, kind of automating some of the kind of mundane operations. Effectively, it means that we're taking already kind of a highly successful, kind of profitable, well-run, oiled kind of machine, and then kind of growing it even faster kind of beyond that. So it means that effectively kind of this is a very kind of cash accretive in a way model where kind of I think that talking about fundraising, there are prime examples of some of the effectively kind of highly recurring and kind of flywheel type businesses that were just accumulating cash over time and that allow them to kind of to start growing kind of over time very, very fast. For example, such as like Constellation Software or kind of some other companies that effectively kind of recycling a lot of the kind of cash of the businesses already acquired to kind of effectively kind of foster their kind of growth even faster and faster and faster. So kind of this sort of models, I think, are because they being kind of highly cash generative kind of models, they do not kind of at some point of time require kind of that much of external funding because the model becomes highly self-sustainable kind of and profitable from the very early days, early on, effectively.
Yeah. So does that change how you think about investors and fundraising yourselves?
I think that for this sort of model, just the way that fundraising kind of works, I think works somewhat differently. So obviously, you do kind of bootstart with kind of a little bit more of usually kind of equity coming in just to get some kind of scale and some
Mm,
mass. I think that in the typical private equity kind of playbooks, it would be then starting to leverage more and more kind of debt together with that equity. I think that in the way that these playbooks are being kind of in a way rewritten by some of the kind of multi-stage venture type kind of asset managers, or for example kind of more typical kind of venture capital investors, is that kind of it's rather about kind of having more kind of equity rather than kind of debt in the beginning of the journey, because effectively kind of there is also much bigger investment compared to the just typical kind of private equity backed roll up goes into investing into technology and goes into kind of proving the technology works and proving into kind of seeing through that uplift of the kind of revenue happening in the business because of better level of service. So like effectively it takes time, and that's why kind of having highly over leveraged business with more kind of debt on top of it straight away, I think is just kind of too risky and probably kind of not justified in the early stage of the business. And this is why I think that a lot of these models kind of rely a bit more on more kind of equity kind of funding coming in the first place, just to kind of get this like machine to head
mm.
start of that. And then kind of at some point of time later down the road, I think that then it can become a little bit more of like a typical-ish kind of private equity playbook with kind of higher leverage of debt, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not how it feels like all this playbook
Mm.
should be written, at least kind of at the current stage.
No, so it sounds like you were kind of rewriting some of those playbooks as well. Does that take a certain type of investor profile? I mean, I know we've talked about, picking the right investor, the individual more than necessarily the
Yeah,
fund. And
yeah,
I know when I speak to investors, they tend to have their own playbook as well. When you're kind of
right.
changing that playbook, does that take a certain type of profile that you
100%. I think that kind of if you would talk about this 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I think that the mainstream idea of investing in the typical kind of venture capital investing, I think still was, and primarily still is, about, I think, B2B type softwares, B2B SaaS, enterprise SaaS, that obviously with mass adoption of AI sees through some transformation changes as well. But it's then can become, for example, maybe not kind of B2B SaaS, it maybe kind of B2B AI SaaS or kind of B2B AI products. But a lot of like venture capital investors, I think, is still highly kind of energized about this topic
mm,
on one end. On the other end, obviously, I think that the word of roll up is like very used terminology, like bread and butter in the world of private equity. So I think that clearly we are talking about someone that in a way operates on the intersection of two worlds, and effectively I think sees through that as an opportunity to kind of even to the extent of create like a new asset class that like sits very much in between this kind of two worlds, where on one end you kind of in a way taking the best of the two worlds, because on one end you're taking kind of the best of the venture capital world in terms of like high speed of growth, in terms of the kind of technology first businesses that reinvent some of the kind of traditional economies. On the other end, you're taking the best of the kind of private equity playbooks with regards to kind of growing acquisitively, and then kind of how, for example, kind of to be effectively integrating and onboarding the businesses on already existing kind of platforms. So this is some of the playbooks that are being kind of well written in the private equity world. So clearly, I think that kind of, as you mentioned at the very beginning, I think that it's growing, and this, I think, understanding is evolving with time. But I think it still takes kind of a handful of investors to, I think, see through this opportunity that sits on the intersection of the kind of typical VC world and typical PE world to
yeah.
operate exactly in the middle. And I think that because of the acquisitive nature of the model, it's also potentially kind of might not be for everyone. So, for example, if you talk about the kind of typical early stage VC with like, I don't know the exact kind of numbers and I haven't kind of calculated the exact math, but I can assume that for the typical kind of early stage tech investor with a kind of pre-seed seed fund kind of the size of 50 to 100 million kind of dollars, potentially that might be a little bit too of a capital
Mm.
intensive game. So potentially kind of might be a little bit out of their pockets to kind of to play this like intersection of the world's AI-enabled kind of roll-ups game. So yeah, it's I think quite specific set of investors. And I think, as you mentioned, it's also quite specific individuals within these funds that I think also kind of find themselves excited about this model. And obviously, I think that there is a lot of funds that are very known, especially multi-stage kind of asset managers that I think very known to kind of start being more vocal about kind of this latest trends, with kind of latest being kind of likes of Lightspeed and likes of Thrive Capital that are kind of changing their kind of financial model from being typical VC to become more RIA type
Yeah.
organization. I think allows them to be much more flexible with regards to
Yeah.
their rate of investing. But obviously, that already kind of predecessed and has done before by a bunch of other kind of Silicon Valley capital investors, such as Sequoia, General Catalyst, Bessemer, and like many, many more that follow the same trend.
It sounds like a challenge to reconcile between, I suppose, speed of growth and that operational efficiency. How do you reconcile those two in an early stage business when you're kind of building it in the trenches? Be able to see kind of the way forward while executing on the ground.
I'm not sure this is a contradiction. I think that it's the feature of every business effectively, because like on one end, every kind of high scale, high growth startup would be facing two challenges. It would be about kind of how we can be continuing acquiring kind of new customers at a high pace on one end, where kind of in our case, effectively kind of we would say it matters less. You can go and like put some marketing dollars on the kind of Facebook or Instagram to acquire new customers, or you can go and acquire an existing business where effectively kind of the key thing, the key asset you acquire is existing customer base, right? So it's effectively just marketing channel for us. And then kind of on the other end, once you acquire these customers, how to kind of make sure that you continue providing outstanding level of service kind of to those. I'm not sure kind of one comes at the expense of the other. It's obviously kind of when you're growing fast, it adds additional kind of stress on the system with regards to kind of making sure that your kind of operational machine catches up with the same kind of pace as your kind of pace of growth catches up. But I think it's just like effectively the role, I think, of the kind of founder or the kind of the key managers of the business, the CEO of the business, to kind of make sure that we balance between kind of the things with regards to kind of is our operational kind of readiness there to make sure that we can kind of start putting into the business
Yeah.
kind of new customers. I think it's just balancing the things effectively.
And how do you think about regulation? And certainly in the UK, we're seeing a lot of regulation changing around renters and landlords. I mean, you've talked about Europe and the US. Regulation plays a part in this. How do you think about responding? Because it's quite a reactive thing around regulation.
Yeah, I think that a lot of regulations, obviously, that do come in like different parts of the world, they come for a reason and primarily kind of they do make sense. Like sometimes they come to protect the landlords more, sometimes they come to kind of protect the tenants more. I think that we obviously kind of appreciate and operate within the same kind of realm of the legislative and regulatory frameworks that we've been kind of applied to. But I think that to some extent, being a technological business allows you to kind of shift and to adapt to these changes quite often even faster, just because like effectively, let's say kind of you introducing kind of recently on 14th of May, so like exactly a week ago, the new regulation being introduced where kind of all letting agent have to comply not just with anti-money laundering checks that they need to kind of check the kind of background reference of the ownership of the landlord of the property that is rented above 10,000 euros or 8,000 pounds approximately a month, but also that there is like a specific list of sanctioned individuals and kind of all your customers would be tenants and landlords and guarantors and kind of everyone else that like effectively can operate with the property needs to be checked vis-a-vis this like list of sanctioned individuals that I think is like a list of tens of thousands of individuals that are scattered across like hundreds of pages. That, for example, the kind of traditional agency, the way that they, I suppose, would need to be kind of dealing with this additional regulation that just comes in is like taking the list of your kind of, let's imagine you have 500 kind of properties in your kind of portfolio. So like effectively you have 500 tenants, you have 500 landlords. Sometimes in one property you have even not just one tenant, but like a few tenancy. For example, it's a couple or
Okay.
someone
Yeah.
sharing the property. And then you might have a few kind of landlords that own the property. And you kind of need to kind of go and manually check for the kind of match of the name of your tenant and landlord versus this list. If they kind of map up, then you need to kind of obviously report this flag to kind of the respective authorities that to inform that you potentially have a risky individual in your property. Imagine how all this process can be done kind of with a technological first way. Kind of obviously you just run a quick script that just checks the name of the match versus kind of the system and takes you kind of literally 20 seconds job as compared to kind of few days job of a person to kind of sit down and do that. So I think that like we obviously appreciate and operate within the realm of the regulatory kind of frameworks that are being introduced because like they do make sense because they protect some of the sides of this marketplace effectively, but it's kind of easier for us quite often to kind of comply to some changes over time.
When you've got things like that, I mean, obviously there's been a lot of talk about LLMs hallucinating and inaccuracies. How do you deal with that aspect of the AI and technology side of things?
I mean, I'm not sure you can eradicate that completely,
No.
to be honest. I think that kind of you can have your internal kind of racks, kind of your internal models. You can have like your internal set of critics where before the response is being kind of sent to the customer, it's effectively being kind of run by the sort of manager or the mediator that like checks the response makes sense. If not, returns it back, challenges, and then provides the new response and then it goes to the customer. So there are ways how you can potentially kind of solve it. No, you cannot solve, improve it technologically to kind of reduce the percentage of the potential kind of false negatives or errors in the kind of messages that you're providing, but I'm not sure you can eradicate it completely. So I think that sometimes you have to admit the fact that like sometimes there would be some kind of discrepancies or some things that might not kind of 100% fully make sense. And I think that's exactly why kind of it's impossible to say that kind of technology would take on everything that like people are doing today. I mean, that's a prime example where kind of obviously there always would need to be kind of a human in the loop. And specifically in our business, I think that like the landlords do rely to us. One of the most precious assets that they have kind of in their life being their property, usually kind of the biggest asset worth in their life. So that's why kind of obviously it's technology to help people, but it's not the kind of technology to replace or technology to kind of interact with the customers directly. I think that it kind of it is not the case, and I doubt it ever would be the case, just because of the kind of use case of how we're applying technology in our specific industry.
Yeah, okay. I mean, look, Dan, has been a fascinating conversation. Final couple of questions. What's next for Dwelly?
I think that there is like a few things. That number one, obviously, it's about kind of proving more and more on kind of more agencies and more kind of points of the UK that the kind of model and the technology do work to provide kind of the better level of service eventually to kind of all the parties. And I think that we're kind of seeing through that kind of step as we speak. I think that once kind of this has happened, it's already kind of well-oiled scaled kind of machine to scale. I think that it's a lot about there are many more cases when the kind of either the tenant or the landlord do operate with the property that is just beyond the transactional rental experience. So kind of, for example, it has to do with things such as like sometimes you're not just only renting, but sometimes you also might decide to sell your property. Sometimes when you're renting, you, for example, don't have kind of all the money required to possess kind of the property. And sometimes you want, for example, to take a mortgage to kind of go and buy the property. Or sometimes you, for example, as a tenant, don't have the money to kind of leave on deposit and you want to kind of consider some of the, for example, reduced deposit or zero deposit scheme. So, for example, you as a landlord want to kind of make sure that the property is safe and consider some of the rent guarantee insurance type kind of schemes. So I think there are a lot of more kind of cases, especially kind of financial products, fintech products that like surround the space. That is definitely kind of an adjacent category, and it's something for us to kind of to touch at some point of time. So kind of this is definitely kind of the closest I would say kind of venue to kind of for the kind of for the expansion in the short term period.
And finally, obviously being in the weeds, in the trenches when you're building, it can be difficult to, I suppose, see success. So how on a daily basis, how do you remind yourself that things are going in the right direction? What do you do to
Yeah,
remind?
I'm personally a very bad person in that. I personally kind of have a hard time to kind of to remind myself that things are actually great. I think that this is what a lot of people that I'm surrounded by are much better than I, because I think that I always kind of in a way impatient. I'm always hungry for kind of what is next. I'm always kind of unhappy about why is it not fast enough? Why cannot we already be there while we're just still here? And I think that what really helps is sometimes I cannot say that I'm very good in doing it on the kind of day-to-day level. Even more, I think I'm quite bad in doing it on day-to-day level because in day-to-day I'm always this like hungry, unhappy, kind of impatient type person. But I think what helps is whenever you kind of do some sort of reflections, at least kind of once a month, but usually kind of we're doing some sort of status check where we are kind of sometimes a bit more frequent. And I think that especially, for example, such as like when we putting, for example, our monthly investor updates to our kind of existing investors and putting the progress of what has happened in a month. I think quite often when we sit down kind of as a founders team and with the management and like looking through what we have achieved throughout the month, we're like, oh wow, I feel like it was a year. How could we have achieved all that in a month? So I think that kind of it's a lot about kind of reflecting through on some of the kind of bigger time horizons. But I'm quite a bad person in general to do that, and especially on the day-to-day level.
So that's something you should do more frequently. Pause and reflect and see
Absolutely.
that progress to remind yourself that it's going well and going as
Oh,
expected.
yeah. Yeah. I need to put myself a sticker to just like, hey, for back, relax, and reflect. It's been a great. I
Excellent.
think that I'm liking it a lot. Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, look, Dan, thank you so much for joining for this conversation. Fascinating to see what you're building. We'll tag you and Dwelly, so if people are interested in getting in touch and working for Dwelly and maybe even investing, they can reach out to you. But Dan, thank you so much for your time, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.